So just to introduce the speaker, Ursula is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Amsterdam. Her research focuses on elections and conflict, like I said, a topic most of us are familiar with, so we're really looking forward to the talk. She's currently working on a project about elections, violence, and parties, which is funded by the European Research Council. From 2018 to 2020, she was the associate editor for European Journal of International Relations. And lastly, she's co-edited a special issue on electoral violence, which came out this year, and it's been published by the Journal of Peace Research. Over to you, Ursula.
Yeah, thank you so much for the kind introduction, and also, for giving me the opportunity to present this work here today to an Indian audience. We're really eager actually to get feedback from people who understand the context, and we haven't been able to travel, so this is a nice second best option. So I also want to say I hope everyone is doing well. I think this is a difficult time for all of us and quite challenging. So please make sure you take care of yourself. I will now share my screen. And once that is done, I can hopefully get my slideshow up. Can everyone see the slides now?
No, not yet.
Oh, wait, not yet. Hold on 1 second. I think we're almost there. Can you see the slides? Yes?
Yes, yes.
Okay, so just please, let me know if something's not working with the slides and I will interrupt. But yes, so as you can see here, the paper I'm presenting today is co-authored with Hanne Fjelde, and I will spend most of my talk to discuss this particular project. However, I wanted to take the first 5 minutes or so to say a little bit more about the project that you already mentioned that I will be working on in the next several years, also because India is an important case for that project. So, whoops, just to make sure I can, okay, can you see the second slide now?
Yes.
Yes?
Yes.
Okay, great, excellent.
Yes.
Okay, so everything's working. It's just I can't see you now, so I'm just kind of talking a little bit blind. Okay, so great. So this is a project that I received funding for about 1.5 years ago, and that I pushed the start date back a little bit also because of COVID. But it's a project that focuses on elections and violence, and in particular the role of parties, and that also means that the paper that I'm presenting you today, right, fits in quite nicely with that. So to explain a little bit more about why should we care about the relationship between elections and violence, I'd like to point out that in many countries, even though almost all countries in the world today hold elections now, it's actually still fairly common that these elections go hand in hand with violence. And if we focus just on deadly violence, right, which is in many ways the most serious form of violence, then more than 1/3 of all elections experience such violence still. And we could mention here, right, the most recent elections in India. I mean, in most states, the elections, I think, were done really well, were very much free and fair. But in West Bengal, which is also the case that we're looking at in our paper, there was substantial violence between the two primary parties contesting the elections. And so from this research, right, there is quite some research already on this question of elections and violence. However, a lot of this literature has actually focused on, well, questions of, what makes elections more violent overall, and, what makes them less violent. So kind of focusing more on the aggregate conditions that explain the absence or presence of violence. And from this research, we know, for example, that certain types of electoral institutions, such as majoritarian elections, tend to see more violence. We also know that more competitive elections tend to see more violence. But what is missing from this literature, which is what I hope to add with my project, is rather than understanding, okay, why do we see more or less violence, I want to understand how does violence actually play out on the ground. And so in terms of the questions that the project will ask and hopefully also answer, the first set of questions, so the first research question that my project will be addressing is questions such as how is violence actually organized? Why do we see more violence in some subnational areas rather than others? Who actually perpetrates the violence? These kinds of questions. But then the second set of questions focuses really on, well, what does violence do to the people actually exposed to it? How does this affect their perceptions, their behavior, etc.? And it's the second set of questions that is kind of the key motivating factor for the paper that I'm presenting today. So this leads me now to explore in more detail, or explain in more detail, what motivated us to write this paper that I shared with you, and also our theoretical framework. So in terms of motivation, one important motivation for us in writing this paper is that we actually think that perceptions of election quality are quite crucial in terms of providing the underpinnings, the micro level underpinnings for democracy. And there's quite some research that would back up this notion. So from existing research, we know that when citizens perceive elections as high quality, then this has positive effects on how they think about democracy, how satisfied they are with democracy. It helps increase participation. It increases trust in institutions. So it has all kinds of positive effects. However, when citizens perceive elections as low quality, then we see more engagement in protests and other extra institutional forms of engagement. So there are lots of reasons to believe that perceptions of election quality are important for democracy. And the particular contribution that we want to make in our paper is to explore the effect of violence on citizens' perception of election quality. And so the question that I'm asking here, right, in many ways, I think a lot of us intuitively would answer yes, of course, when violence happens in elections, it should reduce citizens' perceptions of election quality, because it kind of goes against everything that we think of good quality elections to be about. And from a normative perspective, I think we could also argue that, well, violence in elections is quite incompatible with how we conceptualize or operationalize election quality, because for elections to be free and fair, that usually would imply for us that they are free and fair from violence between the contestants, violence targeting citizens, etc. So what's then somewhat surprising is that actually the research that exists on this question, which isn't very much, finds quite mixed evidence. And this is where we hope to make a contribution. We want to actually develop a theoretical argument that helps explain why there might be some mixed findings in this work. And we also actually conduct a survey experiment, which gives us some advantages in terms of addressing threats to causal inference that might be present in this existing research. So before I develop our argument in more detail, I just want to briefly summarize what we already know about this question. So what do we know about perceptions of election quality? And at a more aggregate level, earlier work has examined the effect of electoral institutions, so particular type of electoral systems or election management bodies and their performance, and whether that affects citizens' perception of election quality. And these are important findings, but also fairly aggregate in the sense that electoral institutions or electoral systems is not something that varies within countries, so can't really help us understand variation in micro level perceptions. Now, there is a second body of research that is more relevant for our work, which focuses more explicitly on local experiences during elections and how that affects people's perceptions. And these studies have looked at parameters such as how poll workers perform, the role of voting technology, also the presence of observers, and how that would affect citizens' perceptions. Now, the most closely related work to our research is work that examines the effect of manipulation on perceptions of election quality. And here, we could think of violence as a form of manipulation, right? Because violence before elections is oftentimes used to affect the outcome, to affect the dynamics of the electoral process. So violence would fit within this broader parameter of essentially subverting electoral outcomes. But what's interesting about work that has looked at either the effect of fraud, violence, or both is that the findings are actually quite mixed. only the 2 studies by Kerr find that there's actually a negative relationship between people who say that they're scared of violence, or people who say that they've experienced fraud. So only his work finds actually this negative relationship. The other studies find no clear relationship. Another problem with existing work that we hope to shed some light on is that they treat all forms of fraud and do not disaggregate between violence and other forms of fraud, such as vote buying. And then finally, existing work is not always clear on the theoretical mechanisms. If we think about why and how election violence could affect citizens' perceptions of the electoral process, then one important mechanism that could be going on here is that people themselves experience violence. And we think that that's one important mechanism. However, we think that that's probably not the most common mechanism. So most people probably don't have personal experience with violence, but rather they hear about violence somewhere. And so this is really the mechanism that we're exploring in our paper. We focus on the effect of information about violence and how this could affect citizens' fraud perceptions. So to now develop the theoretical framework of our paper, if we think about how information about violence affects citizens' perceptions, whether information either leads citizens to improve or lower their confidence in the electoral process, then in the literature, there are fundamentally 2 theoretical perspectives of how people process information and under what conditions they update their perceptions. Now, the first such perspective is what's known as the rational updating model. And the expectations of the rational updating model are fairly straightforward in the sense that the expectation here is that when people receive new information that tells them something about the quality of the electoral process, and here the information that we are interested in is information about violence, but when you hear that someone committed violence in the election, then actually that should lead you to lower your perception of election quality. And in many ways, we could think that violence should be kind of a key red line for people in the sense that, well, when they hear about violence, they should immediately say, okay, this goes against what free and fair elections are about. I'm becoming more critical now in my assessment of the electoral process. And as I already said earlier, right, there is some work that finds this a negative relationship that would be consistent with this rational updating mechanism. However, there's a second theoretical perspective that is somewhat more complex and expects that, this direct effect is actually not that what we should necessarily expect. And so in this perspective, how people respond to information about violence isn't just a function of whether, this is violence that maybe they weren't familiar with, but how people respond to new information is also primarily a function of their pre-existing beliefs and their pre-existing way of thinking about information. And when we think about the question of politics, right, we're interested here in citizens' perception of the election process, then we know in politics, people's partisan beliefs are very important for informing their attitudes. And so the expectation here then would be that how people respond to new information about things, including information about violence, would be a function of whether this information fits with their pre-existing beliefs about an issue. And if that information contradicts their partisan beliefs because it accuses partisans who they identify with of having engaged in violence, having done bad things, they actually reject such information, and not just reject this information, but actually actively try to counter-argue it, try to dispute it, refuse to believe it in a way. And so, on the flip side of this is that, well, when people are presented with information that's consistent with their pre-existing partisan beliefs, then they're more willing to accept it. And there aren't really any, there isn't really work that looks at the question of violence and whether it's subject to motivated reasoning, but there is some work that looks at fraud and finds effects that is consistent with this motivated reasoning perspective. So I've now, explained that the perspective that we are putting forward in the paper is more consistent with the second perspective, with the motivated reasoning perspective. I do want to note that we think that there are some limits to this perspective, right? Because if we take motivated reasoning to the extreme, that it could mean that essentially all beliefs are fixed as a function of pre-existing partisan beliefs and can never be changed, regardless of what information we expose people to. So we think an important additional question for this motivated reasoning perspective is actually to explain, right, under what conditions should we see this particularly frequently, or under what conditions should this be particularly common? And here, we identify two such dimensions also based on existing literature, which has shown that particularly when issues are contentious, when the issues in questions are hostile, when the issues in questions are politicized, we actually tend to see more motivated reasoning. And we think that the issue of violence would certainly qualify as such an issue. And then secondly, existing work has also shown that for people to engage in this kind of partisan motivated reasoning, they need reasonably strong party attachment. And so this could lead some to believe, or has led some to speculate, that we should see motivated reasoning less often in Western contexts. But we think that, to a large extent, that's, very much an open question, because very little work has actually applied motivated reasoning to countries in the global south. And I should also note that these two conditions can be mutually reinforcing, right? When an issue is kind of contentious, plus you have a situation where partisan attachments are strong, we could see how they mutually reinforce each other. But fundamentally, we expect that how people respond to information about violence is really subject to their partisan beliefs, to their pre-existing partisan commitments. So this leads to our main hypothesis, which is that basically, this kind of counter-argue effect that I've already talked about. So we expect that citizens who support the party identified as the perpetrator of election violence in the survey experiments that we administer, that those people, because co-partisans are accused of having done bad things, they actually engage in this counter-arguing. They try to justify violence from their perspective and actually become more convinced that elections have been free and fair. And so in terms of, what are the micro-level mechanisms through which this works, we think it could be, for example, that when people are told about a co-partisan having engaged in violence, this reminds them about something that they actually like, right? Because they have a positive association with that party. And so they kind of rally behind that information or that identity, rather than actually downward adjusting their perceptions of election quality. We also could see a scenario where people, when co-partisans are accused of violence, somehow think of this violence as justified because they've heard a lot about, competing violence between the two parties, and, clearly they think the other party is responsible rather than their co-partisans. So that could be another reason for why we see this kind of counter-arguing. And the converse of this is also true, right? That if people are exposed to information that accuses opposite partisans of having engaged in violence, then we actually should see them to become more critical of elections, because that information is actually consistent with their pre-existing beliefs that it's the other party that's responsible for the violence. Okay, so now I've talked a lot about what motivated us to work on this question, and also what our theoretical argument is. With that, I'm moving to the research design. So before I talk more about the survey experiment, I just want to say a little bit about the context, which will be much more familiar to my audience today than usually. So that's really nice and refreshing for me. I also usually, when I present this to European audiences, I always feel the need to point out that West Bengal might just be one state in India, but has actually about 100 million people. So it's larger than the largest country in Europe. So we should still think what is happening there could be quite important. People in Europe, I think, just generally speaking, don't have trouble grasping just how how large India is in terms of population. But so a couple of things about the elections. I'm showing you here a headline from the elections that highlights that the violence that had happened during the 2019 Lok Sabha election in West Bengal was really party-oriented, and that it frequently involved situations along the lines of what I already alluded to, that essentially there was an incident that was violent or violence happened, and then the BJP accused the TMC, so the two primary competitors, accused each other of being responsible for the violence, said that it was the others who did it, and essentially, mutually alleging or deflecting responsibility and accusing others for being responsible. Now here's another headline, and I'm showing you this one just to emphasize that the violence started several months before the elections, then increased up until election day, but actually also continued after the elections. So really it was, a key feature of the electoral process over time. And then I'm also showing you here a map of violent incidents during the elections across the state of West Bengal. And what you see here, that violence was really kind of spread out around the state. Certainly there were some constituencies that experienced more violence than others, but it wasn't that the violence was just concentrated in one particular area, which would make it less reasonable that we wouldn't expect the effect that I described across the state. But that's not an issue, right? Because we can see here that violence happened across the state. Yeah, I should perhaps mention that, the general sentiment in the literature is that partisanship is weaker in developing countries. But I think we should point out here that in West Bengal, partisanship is actually quite important and might, I think a lot of observers say it's the most important cleavage. And, it might also be informed by issues such as caste or religion, but certainly the party cleavage is very important in West Bengal. I also want to note here is that despite the fact that the elections were quite violent, still this was a context that retained a lot of democratic features. The violence was reported, people could talk about it. So this wasn't an environment where people were scared to even express their preferences, which would be a problem for our empirical setup. But so basically there's a context that should lend itself to exploring the hypothesis that I've outlined. So a little bit more on the survey itself. So this is a survey that we fielded after the election. And we used probability proportional to size sampling. So we first selected districts that were representative in terms of, urban, rural, also population size. And then within those districts, we also sampled again 9 representative locations. And then within those locations, we sampled 12 respondents per location using a random walk procedure. This was a survey that we also pre-registered. So the experiment that I'm about to show to you is something that we registered before we ever got access to the data, meaning that the hypothesis that I showed you, right, we essentially committed to that hypothesis before we knew any of the results. And the experiment was based on, a design where we had one control group that just got some general information about the election, and then 2 treatment groups of equal size that got the treatment with violence and also partisanship. So this is now the Vignette experiment. What you can see here is that the treatment groups, in addition to getting some general information, were also told or reminded about violence that happened in the electoral process. And because of the partisan nature of the violence, and because of our interest in exploring, right, the partisanship dimension, we randomly varied who was allegedly responsible for the violence. So the text was identical to the 2 treatment groups, with the exception of varying whether people heard that the TMC or the BJP was responsible for violence. Now, I do think it's important to highlight some ethical considerations that we thought about when designing the experiment. And I should also note that this was a survey that we carried out in collaboration with Logniti, and Logniti is also a survey research organization that has well, as you know, a ton of experience in conducting surveys in India and also experience with conducting difficult surveys. But nevertheless, I want to just highlight that there are several ethical considerations that we thought about. One thing that was important for us is obviously protecting respondents, especially when you're asking them about potentially sensitive issues or exposing them to potentially sensitive issues such as violence. So we made sure, right, that we got respondents' consent and that they knew that they could stop the survey at any time, and also that they knew that the survey was fully confidential, meaning that there was no way to trace back that they had revealed information to us. Now, we also wanted to make sure that we minimize the risk for potential harm. And to do that, we wanted to field the survey after the elections, right, in the middle of a violent situation. Reading the text that I showed you to respondents could have been more risky. And we made it several months, and we waited, in fact, until the violence had subsided. I mentioned earlier, right? It actually did continue for several months after the elections, but during the fielding of the survey, there were no violent incidents. This is something also that the enumerators confirmed to us. And then also, this was one of the reasons for why we chose a fairly mild vignette where, as you saw, a poll worker was allegedly beaten rather than a more severe violent incident, such as when someone was killed or heavily injured. And we also did this to protect not just the respondents, but also the enumerators, right? Because sending enumerators into, area where violence might have happened also, and then, asking them to read this text could also be riskier if you're mentioning a high salient event. And then finally, we also thought it was important to avoid deceiving respondents in the sense that we didn't want to present information about violence that hadn't actually happened. So the event that I just showed you was actually modeled after real events. I mean, in some respects, it's different from real events in that it doesn't mention a particular location or date of when this happened, but there were events that were very similar to what I had just shown you. So this helped reduce us having to deceive respondents, but nevertheless, we still debriefed them after the survey to highlight that essentially we weren't sharing information with them that they would need to worry about. Okay, so before I show you the results, just a little bit more about the key measures. So a dependent variable is an ordinate variable that measures the freeness and fairness of elections, where the highest value mean that the election was more free and fair. And this is a fairly standard way of operationalizing perceptions of election quality in the literature. And then our independent variables. So as I already mentioned, right, an important dimension of our experiment was to randomly vary whether people were exposed to a treatment mentioning either the TMC or the BJP as responsible for the violence. And that was randomly assigned, meaning also, right, that people were exposed to information that they might not usually read about, right? Because if we think about partisanship, then it might be that you're actually not even, reading news or informing yourself about events where co-partisans are accused of violence. But then in addition to that, right, because we hypothesized that essentially this will be a function of people's own partisanship, how they respond to such a treatment, we interact this violence treatment with how much people trust either the TMC or the BJP. So to measure co-partisanship or opposite partisanship, we use a question where we ask people about how much they trust particular parties. And so then in addition to these key independent variables, we have to include some control variables, particularly also because people's partisanship is clearly not randomly assigned and might be a function also of demographics, how knowledgeable they are, etc. And on top of that, we also control for constituency fixed effects and enumerator fixed effects to account for these, for possible heterogeneity as a result from that. So this leads me to the results. So as you can see, the rectangles here show the main results of the interaction that I just described. And what you can see here is that for the TMC violence treatment, when we interacted with TMC partisanship, so people who support the TMC, we find a positive and significant effect on people's perception of election quality, which means, right, that people who hear about co-partisans having engaged in violence, who also support this party, become more trusting of elections, perceive elections as higher quality. And we find this positive and significant effect for the TMC in our experiment, which is consistent with the hypothesis that I presented to you. However, I should mention that we do not find the same effect for the BJP. So for BJP supporters who were exposed to the BJP violence treatment, they also do not reduce their perceptions of election quality, right, which would be consistent with the rational updating model. But unlike for the TMC, we don't see this counter-argue effect, or we don't see them actually becoming more positive about the electoral process. And so I have a number of, Hanne and I, we have a number of possible ideas for why this might be the case. And this is actually, I'd really appreciate if anybody in the audience has some ideas on that. In particular, I mean, we have kind of 3 ideas for why it might be that we see asymmetry in this effect between the TMC and the BJP. Now, the first potential reason we've talked about is that it might be that in West Bengal, because the BJP is less institutionalized there as a party, and is more recently, right, become important in West Bengal politics. For that reason, it might be that BJP supporters, even if they say, right, they trust the BJP a lot, they're not as committed as partisans as TMC voters and TMC supporters, which is a party that has a much longer history of being involved in politics in West Bengal. So that's one possible reason. Another possible reason is that we think that violence in West Bengal, as I've explained, right, is very partisan. It's, you know, it's the TMC accusing the BJP accusing the TMC. And also historically, if we go back, we can find that before the BJP became a major player in West Bengal, you know, it was violence between the TMC and the CPIM. And so we're thinking, you know, because violence is so partisan in West Bengal, and this is somewhat related to the first point I made, maybe the BJP can't kind of take advantage of the way violence is organized in the state, similar to the TMC, because the BJP certainly also seems to appeal to hostilities in other states, but there it's really the religious cleavage rather than a partisan cleavage. But so that could be another reason for why perhaps we don't see a similarly strong effect for the BJP. And then finally, a final reason, which I think is probably not what's going on, but potentially could be the case, is also that the BJP as election winners, you know, they're just happier with the outcome. And for that reason, you know, because they were perceived widely, right, as having done really well in West Bengal, they don't need to engage in this kind of counter-arguing. All right, so here is just a visual depiction of the results that I just explained. What you can see here, and you know, focus on the right-hand side of the figure, what you can see here is that people who receive the TMC treatment, who are also TMC partisans, so the red dot, they are more likely to perceive elections as free and fair. And again, you know, as I already said, you know, for the BJP, we do not find a similar effect. I mean, we do find, right, that overall they seem to be more positive if they get the BJP treatment and are BJP partisans, but this effect is not statistically significant. Okay, we conduct several robustness tests. For example, we also compare the treatments to each other, omitting the control group. And here we find results that are very consistent with the ones I presented. I should perhaps mention that we also look at not just the interaction between the co-partisan treatment and people supporting that party, but we also look at, well, what happens if people are exposed to the treatment accusing rival parties of having engaged in violence. And here we find, again, for TMC voters, right, TMC voters who are exposed to the BJP prime, they become more critical of elections, which is consistent with our hypothesis and consistent with pre-existing beliefs that they hold. However, again, we do not find a similar effect for the BJP. So this leads me now to conclude, and I think in terms of time, this should be reasonable within the time limit that I was given. Okay, so to conclude, I mean, the first thing I want to note is that we think, our findings are bad news for democracy, and we think they're bad news for democracy in particular because a lot of other research has already shown that when violence happens in elections, it can successfully depress turnout. So it can lead people to withdraw from politics. But our research, actually, our findings show that violence can be in some ways doubly effective, right? So on the one hand, it helps reduce turnout among people who you disagree with. But on top of that, it can also make people who are committed to a particular party, even if that party is responsible for violence, it can make them even more committed as partisans. It can make them more extreme in their partisanship. And so we think this is another unfortunate implication of violence that is problematic for democracy. As I already said, I would love to hear your thoughts on this asymmetry in our findings and what might be possible reasons for that. And, perhaps even how could we try to empirically examine what might be the reason for this asymmetry. So I'd very much appreciate that. I do want to say a couple of things just very briefly about how this travels to other contexts or might travel to other contexts. So, I already mentioned, right, even in India, the violence that happens in West Bengal, well, is for one quite unusual, right? Because in many other states, violence has become very peaceful, even in states where historically there was violence, such as Bihar or, for example. However, I think even though violence might not be as partisan in other Indian states, certainly there are other forms of violence that happen, right? Like religious violence, particularly Hindu-Muslim riots, which have been studied extensively, but also caste violence. And these forms of violence have also been linked to electoral process. And while the dynamics here are somewhat different in the sense that the cleavage or the violence, would be structured around religion or caste, we still think that the dynamics that we outline could be important because we also know that religion and caste also inform voting, right? So, and if these group identities structure both violence and voting, it's not inconceivable that people would similarly engage in this kind of motivated reasoning that we've talked about. And in addition to how this might play out in other places in India, we certainly could think of many other countries where violence is very much partisan in nature. We could just look at at Bangladesh, for example, but also other countries such as Kenya or Nigeria. Okay, so with that, I will conclude and actually stop the screen share so I can see someone other than myself. Other than the screen, I couldn't even see myself or anybody.